I had a life I thought was secure, a comfortable home, a wife I adored, and a business that gave me pride and purpose. After 12 years together, my wife Sarah and I had an anniversary on the horizon. I decided to surprise her with a night at the beach resort where we'd first spent a weekend as a couple, thinking it would be just the spark we needed after a year of drifting apart. But life had different plans. Before moving on to the rest of the story, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, kindly subscribe it to get the most updated story. So, when I arrived at the resort, bouquet in hand, Sarah wasn't there. After an anxious wait, I saw her entering the lobby laughing, her hand intertwined with another man's. They seemed too comfortable, too familiar. My heart sank, the shock numbing my senses as I watched her lean in to kiss him. I felt anger, sadness, and confusion all at once, but instead of confronting them, I slipped out the back door. That night, I drove around aimlessly, memories flooding in and out, as I started to connect the dots of her late-night meetings and hidden phone calls. Instead of anger alone, I began to feel a chilling resolve. I wasn't going to confront her right away. No, this was something that needed planning. My mind shifted into a darker, more strategic mode as I thought of ways to unravel everything she held dear. Over the coming weeks, I put the pieces in place. Meeting with a lawyer who could build my case, hiring an investigator to gather every piece of damning evidence, and subtly redirecting our shared finances. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances, playing the role of a husband who knew nothing, hiding every hint of the plan that was unfolding in my mind. Finally, on the night of our anniversary dinner, when she thought I would forgive her, I laid out every piece of her betrayal. In her shock, she begged me to reconsider, claiming it had been a mistake, but I showed no mercy. She was left with nothing, losing her home, social circle, and the life we had built. I watched her fall apart, detached from the emotion I might have once felt. In the end, I had won every inch of the battle. But when I was alone, I wondered if I had lost something much more valuable in the process. After that night, things didn't get easier. If anything, they became more grueling. My life, once filled with routine and comfort, turned into a cold series of calculated moves. Every day was another step in my plan to dismantle Sarah's life, piece by piece, just as she had done to our marriage. I wasn't a man of blind rage. I was methodical, deliberate, and exacting. I didn't shout, didn't accuse her with a raised voice. I simply acted. The next morning, I awoke to the cold realization of my new reality. Sarah and I had shared a life and a home for 12 years, but now it all felt like a lie, like I'd been unknowingly playing a role in a script she had already rewritten. I spent days rehearsing every encounter, every whispered word, watching her with new eyes. Her laughter rang hollow, her casual smiles now felt too forced. I saw her guilt in the slight hesitation before she answered my questions, in the way she checked her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. Each of these small betrayals fueled my resolve. The first thing I did was meet with a lawyer. Henry Wells was a man with a reputation for viciously protecting his clients, and he promised me nothing less. I laid out my evidence, dates of unexplained absences, bank statements showing strange withdrawals, texts that had lingered just a little too long on her screen before she nervously swiped them away. We built the case like it was a wall, brick by brick, each piece of evidence ensuring Sarah would have nothing to fall back on. But that was only the beginning. I needed her to feel the isolation I felt, the loneliness that had settled into my chest the night I saw her with him. So, I began the subtle task of unraveling her relationships, both social and professional. I leaked hints of her infidelity to our mutual friends, ensuring that no one would trust her, that no one would lend a sympathetic ear when she needed it most. And when her friends started to drift away, avoiding her calls and making excuses not to meet, I could see her distress slowly growing. One evening, after a particularly chilly dinner, she tried to break through the silence. "Is something wrong?" she asked cautiously, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. I looked at her and shrugged. "Nothing that I can't handle," I replied, keeping my tone indifferent. I wanted her to feel as though something was wrong, but to doubt herself too much to know what exactly it was. As weeks passed, I continued to lay traps that she would only realize too late. I had our finances restructured, cutting her off from our shared accounts. And every time she raised an eyebrow at a missing transfer or an unusually high credit card charge, I deflected with vague, dismissive answers. At one point, she brought it up over breakfast, trying to keep her tone light, but failing miserably. "Did you transfer some funds out of the joint account?" "Yes," I replied, not bothering to elaborate. "Is there something I should know?" she pressed, her voice tinged with worry. I set my coffee cup down deliberately. "Sarah," I said, "some things are best left unsaid. Besides, I know you've had your share of secrets lately." The way she paled told me I had struck a nerve. She was smart enough to know that her carefully constructed life was beginning to crumble. And yet, she remained silent. She didn't dare to confront me. That was what I wanted for her to feel trapped, to realize that her life was slipping through her fingers, just as mine had the moment I'd seen her with another man. My final move would come when she was least prepared. The days following that breakfast exchange were filled with a strange tension. Sarah grew quieter, a constant shadow of worry in her eyes. And while she didn't speak her concerns out loud, her behavior became more withdrawn, as if she were trying to shrink into herself to avoid detection. Little did she know that every small reaction, every glance and nervous fidget, only deepened my resolve. To the outside world, we continued as a couple who had simply hit a rough patch. We still attended family gatherings, went to friend dinners, and even exchanged the occasional public smile. But beneath the surface, our home was a battleground of unspoken truths, with each of us locked into our own guarded silence. The next step in my plan required a certain degree of precision. I wanted more than just her friends and family to pull away. I wanted her career, her pride and joy to fall apart, just like everything else she'd taken for granted. After a decade working with dedication, Sarah had recently risen to a senior management position at an advertising firm. One of the few things in her life she could say was wholly her own. She had spent years working her way up, and I knew how much it meant to her. And just as she'd spent years building it, I would now take my time to dismantle it. Through a quiet back channel, I managed to get in touch with one of her firm's board members, an acquaintance I'd made through mutual business dealings. Over coffee in a quiet, upscale cafe, I shared just enough to stoke his suspicions. I mentioned her personal issues and recent behaviors in a concerned, almost embarrassed tone, painting a picture of a woman whose personal life was slipping. I was careful not to sound malicious, yet I left him with enough hints to question Sarah's reliability. Within days, the effect was visible. She came home late more often, weighed down by the exhaustion of endless meetings and presentations that, somehow, didn't seem to go in her favor. At one point, she muttered something about her manager, expressing concern for her well-being, and I could tell it grated on her. Sarah, who had always been proud, fiercely independent, was now under a microscope of scrutiny, unsure where the judgment was coming from or why. Her workplace had been her haven, a place where she could be valued without question. But now, that too was slipping out of her control. Then came the breaking point. One rainy evening, she came home soaked, clutching an umbrella with hands that shook. She was pale, her hair plastered to her forehead, and her face wore an expression of despair. I heard her sigh a deep, defeated sound as she slipped off her shoes by the door, her usual posture crumbling. She didn't even glance at me when she walked into the kitchen. "Work was rough?" I asked casually, not looking up from the magazine I was pretending to read. She hesitated. I could feel the weight of her gaze, searching for something in me she couldn't quite name. "They put me on probation," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her shoulders sagged as if saying the words aloud made them even more real. I kept my face neutral, feeling a flash of satisfaction inside. "Probation?" I echoed, sounding just the right mix of concern and surprise. "But what for?" "Apparently, they're worried about my focus. They said I've been distracted lately." Her voice broke as she spoke. "It's ridiculous. I've given them everything for 10 years. Her last words were more to herself than to me, but I stayed silent, letting her distress hang in the air. She slumped onto a chair, dropping her face into her hands. For a moment, I felt a pang of something almost like pity. But then I remembered this was the same woman who had broken my trust, who had taken my love and stomped on it without remorse. That twinge of pity vanished as quickly as it had come. The following week, I tightened my grasp on our financial situation. I had been moving our joint assets into accounts solely under my name for some time, and I now made the last of those transfers. Sarah had no idea that her savings, the cushion she'd relied on in case of emergencies, was slipping through her fingers. By the time she noticed, it would be too late. I sat back and watched, barely concealing my grim satisfaction as she descended further into confusion and frustration. She must have known something was wrong. She was too smart not to feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, but I had covered my tracks too well. All she could do was grasp at shadows, wondering why her world was crumbling around her. Then, one evening, she confronted me. It was late, almost midnight. I was finishing a glass of scotch in the living room when she appeared, her hair a mess and eyes ringed with dark circles. She looked thinner than usual, worn down, like the last few months had drained the life out of her. She stood silently in the doorway, her hands fidgeting as if she was gathering the courage to say what she had come to say. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to know if I've done something to upset you." I gave her a long, unreadable look. "Why do you ask?" "Because." She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. "Everything is falling apart. My job, my friends, even our—" Her voice broke, and she looked down. "Our marriage," she finished, almost choking on the word. She stood there, vulnerable, waiting for me to give her some reassurance, a comforting word, something that would tell her everything was going to be all right. But I gave her nothing. "Sarah," I said finally, my voice steady and unfeeling, "maybe you should ask yourself why all this is happening. Her face fell, and she looked at me as if she'd been slapped. I could see the faint glimmer of understanding dawning in her eyes, the realization that maybe just maybe I wasn't as oblivious as she thought. The look in her eyes that night was one I'd never forget, a mixture of betrayal and terror, like a person who's just realized the ground beneath them is hollow. But Sarah wasn't one to give up so easily, even as she grew more desperate. She'd make small attempts to mend things, offering to cook my favorite meal, suggesting we take a weekend getaway, or trying to pull me into conversations that felt as forced as they were strained. Each attempt reeked of guilt, and I'd meet her kindness with cold indifference, knowing it only fed her confusion and fear. One evening, as I was sitting at the kitchen table going through our finances, she came in quietly, leaning against the counter. I pretended not to notice her, focusing on my task. "Daniel." Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "I know I haven't been the best wife lately. I know I've hurt you, and maybe that's why things feel so wrong." I didn't look up. "What are you trying to say?" She swallowed, glancing down. "Can we just talk? I feel like I'm losing you. Like I'm losing everything." I looked up at her then, my face a mask of calculated neutrality. "What is it you're afraid of losing, Sarah? The marriage? The money? Your reputation?" Each word hit her like a slap, and her face turned pale. "Why are you being like this?" she whispered, almost to herself. "I think you know why," I replied, my voice as cold as steel. She didn't say anything, just stood there in stunned silence. And for a brief moment, I saw something crack within her, as if the last of her illusions had been stripped away. She stumbled out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she retreated to the sanctuary of our bedroom. After that night, things became eerily calm. Sarah stopped trying to connect, the air between us now filled with a silent truce. But I knew it wouldn't last. She had tasted enough fear to feel trapped, cornered, and I was preparing to deal the final blow. A few days later, I received a call from the private investigator I had hired. He informed me that Sarah had indeed been trying to reconnect with her lover, desperate to find solace in him as everything else in her life fell apart. My pulse quickened as I heard the details. Phone calls, emails, and even an attempt to meet him at a cafe that he didn't bother showing up for. She was unraveling, and he wanted nothing to do with her now that her perfect life was in shambles. Knowing this only fueled my resolve to push her further. The following weekend, I decided to take her out for dinner. It had been months since we'd gone anywhere together, and she looked taken aback when I suggested it, clearly suspicious. But her face softened, and she agreed, looking almost hopeful. I was planning the night carefully. It would be an opportunity to confront her in a way she wouldn't expect. We went to a quiet restaurant out of town, a place we used to frequent before our lives became complicated. For the first half of the evening, I played along, engaging in small talk and even complimenting her, letting her think that maybe, just maybe, things were finally turning around. She looked genuinely relieved, her shoulders relaxing as she clinked her wine glass against mine with a tentative smile. But halfway through the meal, I brought up the topic I knew would break her. "You know, Sarah," I said casually, setting my fork down, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." She looked up, wary but intrigued. "What is it?" "Do you remember that evening at the beach resort?" I asked, keeping my tone light, as if I were discussing a fond memory. She froze, her wineglass halfway to her lips. I saw her throat bob as she swallowed hard. The resort?" "Yes," I said, my gaze boring into her. "The night you were with him." Her face turned ashen, and she set her glass down with trembling hands. "Daniel, I didn't let her finish. "You thought I didn't know, didn't you?" My voice remained calm, almost detached, as if I were discussing someone else's life. "Please, just let me explain," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time in months, I saw genuine fear. Not the nervous glances or subtle anxieties she'd shown before, but real, visceral fear. "What is there to explain, Sarah? I saw you with him. I saw you betray everything we built together." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "And you know what hurts the most? The fact that you thought you could hide it from me." Her tears spilled over, and she reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she whispered, broken. "I never meant for it to go this far. I was lonely, and things were hard, and—" "Lonely?" I scoffed, cutting her off. "You have no idea what loneliness is, Sarah. But you're about to." I left her at the restaurant that night, walking out as she sat there, sobbing quietly. The cold air outside hit me like a slap, but it felt refreshing, like shedding the last layer of a decaying relationship. The next step in my plan was already in motion. Over the next month, I escalated things further. The small reminders of my control over her life, the frozen bank accounts, the rumors, the cold indifference began to wear her down visibly. She was skittish, nervous around me, her once bright demeanor reduced to a shadow of itself. And then came the final twist. One night, she came to me, her face haggard and pale. "Daniel," she whispered, barely meeting my eyes. "I need help." "Help?" I replied coldly, watching her struggle to find words. "Yes, financially," she admitted, her voice thick with shame. "Everything's falling apart. I can't keep up with the bills. I just need a little to get back on my feet." It took everything in me not to smile. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. She had no money, no allies, nothing to fall back on. And now she was asking me, her betrayed husband, for help. "Sarah," I said, my voice dripping with feigned concern, "you brought this on yourself. Maybe you should think about finding someone else to lean on." "Oh wait, he's already left you too, hasn't he?" Her face crumpled, and she let out a quiet sob. I didn't feel satisfaction this time. Instead, there was only a hollow sense of completion. She was truly broken, her pride stripped away, her life reduced to ruins. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the weight of everything settled over me. I had succeeded in dismantling her life, just as I planned. But as the house remained dark and silent around me, I realized something that would haunt me for years to come. In destroying her, I had also destroyed the man I once was. There was no undoing what I'd done, no piece of our old life left to salvage. And with that thought, I understood the true cost of vengeance. In the days following that final confrontation, I felt a strange emptiness. The satisfaction I'd expected from dismantling Sarah's life had faded, replaced by a lingering hollowness that gnawed at me when I was alone. I should have felt triumphant, victorious, but instead, I felt like I'd been left standing in the ruins of my own making, unsure of who I was anymore. I had become someone I barely recognized, my life defined by resentment and revenge. One morning, as I sat sipping coffee in the stillness of an empty kitchen, a thought occurred to me. Was this really the end? I'd won, hadn't I? Sarah was devastated, alone, and destitute, with no one left to turn to. I'd made sure of that. Yet as much as I'd wanted to close this chapter, to move on from the betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. Then, one evening, I received a message that set off a whole new chain of events. It was a voicemail, garbled and quiet, left on my phone by a number I didn't recognize. I put it on speaker, listening to the shaky voice on the other end. It was Sarah. "Daniel, please, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I don't have anyone else. I've lost my job, the bank's taken the apartment, and I have nowhere else to go. I'm at a motel, room 203. If you could just." Her voice trailed off, filled with a desperation that twisted something deep inside me. For a moment, I felt an impulse to reach out to her, to extend an olive branch, but I quickly shoved the thought away. This was what she deserved, wasn't it? I told myself that I didn't care if she was at a dead end, or if she had no one to lean on. She brought this on herself. But a few days later, curiosity got the best of me. I drove to the motel where she'd left her last message, not entirely sure why I was going or what I expected to find. It was a seedy place on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people went when they had nowhere else left. I pulled into the parking lot, watching the flickering neon vacancy sign casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. As I approached room 203, I noticed the window blinds were drawn tight, and I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to let her continue wallowing in the mess she'd made. But a stronger, darker part of me wanted to see her one last time, to witness the extent of her ruin firsthand. I knocked on the door, and after a long silence, I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps. The door opened a crack, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her face pale and hollow. She looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew, her eyes sunken, her cheeks gone. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as she looked at me, a flash of recognition followed by shame. "Daniel," she whispered, clutching the door as if she needed it to stay standing. "I didn't think you'd come." I crossed my arms, keeping my expression cold. "You called. What do you want?" She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I just needed someone to talk to. I know I don't deserve it, after everything I've done. But You don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You don't deserve anything from me, Sarah. You threw everything away." Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might slam the door in my face. But instead, she stepped back, gesturing for me to come in. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind me. It was a cramped, dimly lit space, with peeling wallpaper and the stale smell of cigarettes. She sat down on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands nervously, and I stood by the door, watching her with guarded contempt. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made mistakes. Horrible mistakes. I was selfish, and I thought I could fix it later. But now I don't even know who I am anymore. I've lost everything." I said nothing, just waited, letting her fill the silence with her own guilt. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she continued, her voice trembling. "But I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to hear it. One last time. The way she said, one last time, sent a chill through me. There was a finality in her tone that I couldn't ignore, and a flicker of fear stirred in my chest. I looked at her, studying the hollow expression on her face, the dark circles under her eyes. She was at rock bottom, and something in her voice hinted that she didn't expect to climb back up. I almost turned to leave, to walk out and never look back. But then, something stopped me. Is that what you wanted to say? I asked, my tone biting. That you're sorry? You think that makes up for all the lies? The betrayal? She flinched, nodding. I know it doesn't, but I needed you to hear it anyway. In that moment, I felt a twisted surge of anger, a burning need to twist the knife one last time. You destroyed my life, Sarah. You took everything I cared about and stomped on it without a second thought. And now you want me to feel sorry for you? You want me to forgive you? Tears streamed down her face, and she buried her head in her hands, sobbing quietly. I watched her, feeling a dark satisfaction that bordered on cruelty. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To see her broken, begging for forgiveness, with nowhere left to turn. But as I stood there, a strange thought crept into my mind, a doubt that made me pause. Had I gone too far? Had I become someone just as ruthless as the person I'd wanted to punish? I turned without a word and left the room, letting the door slam shut behind me. As I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the revenge I chased so relentlessly had left me emptier than before. But there was no going back. I crossed too many lines, and the damage was done. The next morning, I found a letter slipped under my door. It was from Sarah. She'd left town for good, she said. She was going to start over, somewhere far away, where she could try to rebuild a life from the ashes of what she destroyed. She didn't blame me for what I'd done, and she didn't ask for forgiveness. She just wanted me to know that she was leaving, and that I'd never hear from her again. As I read the letter, a strange hollowness filled me, a sense of loss that went beyond Sarah. I had become a man obsessed with revenge, a man who had sacrificed his own happiness to ruin someone else's. And now, in the silence of an empty home, I realized that my victory had left me with nothing but bitterness and regret. Years later, when people ask me about my marriage, I'd tell them a story of betrayal and heartbreak, of a man who'd been wronged and sought justice. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd let revenge consume me, and in the end, it had cost me more than I could ever get back. For weeks after reading her letter, I went through the motions of life, a hollowed-out version of myself. Each night, I'd sit in the quiet of our now empty home, surrounded by the remnants of what had once been a shared life, replaying our years together in my mind. Sarah was truly gone, off to start anew somewhere else. I should have felt relieved, maybe even liberated. Instead, I felt as if I had carved out a part of myself that I could never reclaim. One evening, while cleaning out the closet, I stumbled upon an old showbox hidden behind a stack of suitcases. Curious, I opened it and found a collection of our old memories. Postcards from vacations, Polaroids from our first apartment, and a small stack of letters Sarah had written to me during our first year of marriage. I'd forgotten about these, forgotten that, once upon a time, we'd been in love, bound by something stronger than pride or anger. I leafed through the letters, her younger handwriting, bringing back memories of a time when we'd been inseparable, when we'd shared hopes and dreams. And with each word, a sinking realization hit me. In my quest to make her suffer, I'd lost sight of the man I'd once been, a man capable of forgiveness, of compassion. But it was too late now. I'd driven her away, and there was no undoing the damage I'd done. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was a text message from an unknown number. My heart sank as I opened it, half expecting another desperate plea from Sarah, something that would pull me back into the spiral of our broken past. But the message was brief and chilling. I know what you did to her. Meet me at the bar on 7th and Pine. Midnight. My pulse quickened, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. But a strange sense of curiosity and a lingering fear pushed me to go. At midnight, I found myself at the bar, dimly lit and nearly empty, nursing a drink as I waited, scanning the room for any sign of the person who had sent the message. After a few minutes, a man in his mid-40s approached, his expression unreadable. He sat down across from me without a word, his eyes studying me carefully. I felt a prickle of unease as I looked at him, wondering who he was and how he knew about Sarah. "You must be Daniel," he said finally, his voice low. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "And you are?" "Call me Mike," he replied, leaning back in his chair. I used to know Sarah. Quite well, actually. A flash of anger rose within me. This was the man she'd left me for the man she'd chosen over her own husband. But I kept my expression neutral, not wanting to betray the storm of emotions churning inside me. "I know what you did," he continued, his tone chillingly calm. "I know how you ruined her life, isolated her, cut her off from everything. I know about the financial sabotage, the rumors, all of it." My heart pounded, but I forced myself to keep a steady gaze. "And she brought this on herself." He gave a bitter laugh. I'm not here to judge you, Daniel. But I think you need to know something. Something she didn't get the chance to tell you. I leaned forward, my voice hard. And what would that be? Mike hesitated, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. Sarah. She didn't cheat on you, not in the way you think. The night you saw us together at the resort, that was a goodbye. We'd been close friends in college, and she'd reached out to me for support because she was going through a tough time. That night was our final meeting. My stomach twisted. No, I saw you with her. Saw her. Kiss you. He nodded slowly. She did kiss me, but it was a goodbye kiss, Daniel. She decided to work things out with you, to put everything into your marriage. She told me as much, and I was just a friend she leaned on. Whatever you think happened, didn't. A wave of nausea swept over me as I processed his words, the weight of my own actions crashing down on me with brutal clarity. Everything I'd done, the revenge, the sabotage, the relentless destruction, had been based on a misunderstanding, a single misinterpreted moment. Sarah had been trying to work things out, to find a way back to us, and I'd ripped her life apart, blinded by my own pride and fury. I sank back in my chair, the room spinning as the reality of my actions hit me like a freight train. Mike watched me in silence, his expression a mix of pity and disappointment. What do you want from me? I whispered, my voice hollow. He sighed. I don't want anything from you, Daniel. I just thought you deserved to know the truth. He stood, slipping his coat back on. Whatever peace you thought you'd find in revenge, I hope you realize now it wasn't worth it. And with that, he walked out, leaving me alone to grapple with the wreckage of my own making. For weeks, I was consumed by the revelation. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I was haunted by the memory of Sarah's final words, her quiet apologies, the way she looked at me with desperation, trying to make me understand. I'd ignored her pleas, her explanations, too wrapped up in my own anger to listen. And now, it was too late. A few months later, I learned that Sarah had settled in a small town upstate, working in a quiet bookstore, far removed from the life she'd once known. I never reached out to her, how could I? What could I say that would undo the damage I caused, the suffering I'd inflicted? I'd taken everything from her, leaving her with no choice but to start over from scratch. I often thought about going to see her, about apologizing, about finding some way to make amends. But each time, I stopped myself, knowing that my presence would only bring back memories of a life destroyed. She deserved peace, and I knew I could never give that to her. In the end, I was left with the hollow realization that my quest for vengeance had cost me everything I'd once valued. I had won the battle, but I had lost my soul. And as I sat alone in the silence of my empty home, surrounded by the ghost of a life I'd shattered, I knew that I would carry the weight of my actions for the rest of my days, a punishment far greater than anything I could have imagined.